morning to all of you. Well, everyone wants to talk, but I think we're going to start immediately now. Otherwise, we'll be in problems with the time schedule. Good morning and welcome to the second day, the first full day of this conference. Yesterday we had a wonderful opening session, I think, with how would I call it, a mind-broadening first keynote speaker. This is the first full day. We're not exactly in the same setting anymore, but we're very used to this kind of setting, aren't we? It is my great pleasure and honor to open this second keynote speech of the EST conference. And it is, of course, my honor to introduce Paul Bandia to you. We're very happy that he's here today. Paul Bandia, well, almost every one of you knows him quite well, I can imagine, from Concordia University in Montreal, Canada, where he's a professor in translation studies. He's also an executive council member of IADIS, and I maybe can say that is symbolically illustrating the intercontinental outreach of EST. He's also the president of ATSA, the Association for Translation Studies in Africa. Now that Europe is in Africa, it's very good to link that and to combine these two, I think. We all know him as an authority, a very well-known specialist in translation theory and history. In post-colonial studies, most of all, that's the reason why most of us know him, I think, connecting that to translation studies, of course, and in intercultural relations in general, particularly focusing on encounters between the global South and the global North. It is our EST pleasure to have him here, and he will talk today about, as you can see, translation, power asymmetry, and minority language cultures. It's interesting, I don't know how the three terms will be interconnected. They are well connected by two commas here, but he will explain you what the two commas exactly will mean, I suppose. Professor Bandia, dear Paul, it is my great pleasure that you're here, and it is my great pleasure to give you the floor. Please welcome Paul Bandia.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction. It makes me realize that at least I'm doing something. People know me, they know what I do. But I must thank the organization, the leaders of the EST Association for inviting me. It's been a long time since I attended EST, not out of lack of interest, but because whenever it occurred, whenever it was happening, I was being invited somewhere else. So it was kind of cheaper for me to go where it was paid for, as it was cheaper for me to come here now because it was paid for. So I'm so delighted to be here, and especially given the fact that this is happening in Africa, and I suppose there is a reason why this is happening in Africa. It is delightful to imagine that the first outing of the EST from out of Europe is into Africa, and I take that to be something as a compliment, as something good. It is, I would imagine, not entirely altruistic, but there's a potential for African organizations or associations such as ATSA, I suppose, and other groups to work with EST to make translation a more interesting discipline in Africa, where actually, at the moment, there are obvious difficulties that I hope this kind of collaboration will help. So even though it's not entirely altruistic, there are good things to come out of it. Like they say, there are very good people on both sides. I'm alluding to something. I hope people know that. There are very good people on both sides. And I think because of that, there's a good chance that some very good things will come out of this. I am also pretty sure that I wasn't invited because of my exceptional entertainment skills. Or my communication skills. I'm just a very matter-of-fact type of person, which does not mean that I'm boring. It simply means that when I'm in a text, I do the classic North American thing, which is presenting the text and hope that people draw from the text and not get sidetracked by the entertainment value of it. And so, I am hoping, therefore, that because I was invited for this, it also implies that this is happening in Africa. I'm a son of this continent. It's my ancestral home. I've done work that has been almost entirely devoted to Africa, projecting African translations on the world stage. And so it's indeed, for me, a recognition that I have been chosen to do this in Africa. It is really quite humbling and touching that this is the case. It's also that I was thinking, frankly, that it is not necessarily because, as I said earlier, because of the content of my character that I'm being invited here. I'm probably borrowing from MLK, if you know who MLK is. It's more about the current of my work, the content of it, more so than the content of my character, even though it would be a bit facetious or a bit irresponsible to vouch for my own character. Okay? All right. So I'm going to speak about, given the venue and the occasion, I'm going to speak about the place of Africa within the expanding cultures and languages of this world, the way we are dealing with it within the context of globalization. It is important to talk about that now because we haven't talked about it enough. We've talked so much about Africa in relation to its own personal representations, but now that we are dealing with a very expanding globalization, it is, I think, important to know how Africa fits in this, how Africa is going to cope with this expanding globalization that is obviously not happening on an equal or level playing field. That's what I'm particularly trying to convey today. So if you would allow me, I will start reading and stop when I can to put in a few anecdotes that might be making it a bit lighter. But the most important thing is to get exactly what I'm saying about the position of African literature, the position of African tradition, and how the aspect of inequality or power imbalance between the rest of the world would impact on African experiences. In the initial stages of translation studies, the object of study was often viewed as non-polemic and unequivocal transfer between two relatively stable language cultures. When I started studying translations in French universities, that's the way we saw it. It's about dealing with two languages and doing whatever you can to make sure that those languages are supposedly maintaining same equivalency. The object was to ensure complete or total equivalency between established and well-defined monolithic entities, with particular emphasis on linguistic and comparative stylistic approaches devoid of any ideological concerns. The notion of fidelity, with its implied moral or religious overtone, as sanctioned by Judeo-Christian belief systems, was central to any ethical consideration of the translation act. The task of the translator was viewed as one of resolving differences and establishing congruency between languages and cultures. The linguistic bias inherent in this conceptualization of translation had reduced the art to a mere mechanical craft, which in earlier times served scholastic and pedagogical interests. You know, when translation was mainly seen as a means to teach the other language, and it wasn't much more than that. Even with the professionalization of translation, the predominant understanding was the restitution in the target language of the full equivalency or sameness of meaning derived from the source language. As theoretical interests grew in the field, and some theorists began questioning the very essence of translation by raising issues related to notions of untranslatability, practitioners began to wonder if the theorists were indeed talking about the same art or craft which they practiced daily and with palpable and successful or rewarding results. The notion of the incommensurability of cultures was virtually absent in translation discourse, as most practitioners would engage with historical cognate languages. In fact, for most practitioners, it would have been difficult to imagine the notion of inequalities at that time, when the entire enterprise of translation was construed as an honest, objective attempt to establish equivalency between language cultures. Then came the cultural turn in translation studies in the 1990s that we've all talked about, which opened up the field to include several other factors: cultural, ideological, political, sociological, which are likely to influence the translation process. Inspired by the scholarship in the area of cultural anthropology, especially with respect to research involving non-Western cultures, and the cultural turn had an enormous impact on scientific discourse in anthropology and sociology, and eventually, as we do know, on translation studies. Although Europe had already had its own realities of asymmetry between dominant and minority cultures and languages, the concept of minority, as viewed within translation studies, eventually took root, became a paradigm of research, and took hold in the context of power relations or power differentials as a research paradigm resulting from the consequences of Western imperialism. This seismic shift in the humanities and the social sciences enhanced translation research beyond the mere linguistic and stylistic approaches, and set the stage for accounting for translation phenomena in the light of power relations between dominant and subaltern language cultures, as well as in terms of issues related to transculturality in the encounter between distant or remote language cultures. Accounting for inequalities or power differentials in translation studies enlarged the field and enhanced its profile by adopting a mainly interdisciplinary approach, intersecting with a variety of disciplines such as postcolonial studies, cultural studies, anthropology, philosophy, gender, and queer studies. Translation ceased to be viewed as a mere restitution of meaning and understood in its wide range of effect and complexity, involved in encounters between disparate cultures with at times conflicting worldviews and divergent historical circumstances. The foundational pragmatic dimension of translation was now being enhanced by a metaphorical conceptualization of translation, enabling the field to intersect with various areas of scientific inquiry, and providing concepts and theoretical frameworks for elucidating questions related to transculturality and translation, even in different fields. So concepts derived from translation were beginning to be very useful in other fields of studies in the humanities and social sciences. It is in this context of this overlap between the pragmatic and the metaphorical in translation studies that issues of power relations or inequalities can be better explored across historical space and time, from the early encounter of pre-industrialized and industrialized worlds to our current context of globalization. In the early stages of this encounter, the practice of translation consisted mainly in capturing and deciphering the worldviews of the other, the savage, so to speak, to know what made them tick, know what made them tick, as it were, to be better control, dominate, and assimilate them into the inevitable long march of civilization. Although purporting to be a factual or literal translation of dominated people's culture for the sheer anthropological understanding of their humanity, the effect or weight of inequality had dogged translation from the very beginning, as it was never practiced on an even playground, but rather pursued on the basis of an agenda with an imperial devotion to what the French would call la civilisation, n'est-ce pas, la mission civilisatrice, the civilizing mission. Even among cognate languages, such as European languages, there is often a power dynamic that underlies the need and practice of translation. And for those who work with European languages would often notice that even among European languages, there is a power dynamic between languages. So it's not always between the North and the South, per se. Okay? All right. More often than not, translation flows from major to minor languages. For instance, there is often a power dynamic that underlies the need and practice of translation. And for that reason, you get the feeling that because of power differential, minority languages often assume what you would call a translating or a translated existence. If you look around many cultures, the minority language seems to be the one that is considered to be the translating or translated culture. This one-way traffic is even more relevant in our current context of globalization, which is largely commandeered by the dominant economic and military global powers. It is said that empires do not translate. I suppose you've heard that. Empires do not translate for obvious reasons. Rafael Vicente discusses that in one of his presentations. And as cliches go, this statement is fundamental to understanding the power dynamic inherent in the translation process. If empires do not dictate, it tells you straight away who needs translation, for the most part. The adoption of power relations as a paradigm in translation studies is fundamental to the understanding of the pivotal role of translation in the current context of globalization. If contemporary globalization is understood as the spread of an essentially Western worldview or way of life, then translation has been instrumental in the global westernization of economics, languages, and cultures. Drawing on post-colonial and postmodern discourses, the intersection of translation between majoritarian and minoritarian cultures, or between the centers of power and their peripheries, is discussed here in light of the power differentials that have characterized relations historically in the context of colonization, post-colonization, neo-colonialism, and globalization. I'm going through this particular set of historical periods just so that I can put it clearly in terms of African contexts or other colonial contexts. With respect to the latter, the globalization, particular emphasis is placed on the impact of inequalities on translation in the linguistic, cultural, and material exchanges between the global North and the global South. There is a close link, and this is something that scholars are trying to establish. There is a close link between the spread of modern-day globalization and the historical fact of colonization and empire. Globalization would not have been possible without colonization, understood as the political and economic domination of a territory and its population by citizens of another territory. Indeed, contemporary globalization is an extension of Western imperialism, as the acquisition of territory, control of natural resources, and the exploitation of other humans for cheap and profitable labor remain a constant, tracing a direct link between imperial history and globalization. In fact, it is rather interesting that today's key players in worldwide globalization include nations that evolved out of settlement colonies, whereby Europeans resulted or founded new homelands in territories outside Europe, eliminated or marginalized indigenous peoples, developed what I call highly localized economic systems, localized because they're global economic systems but localized within this context, developed highly localized economic systems that they intended to be better than what they had in Europe that they immigrated from, and imposed socioeconomic world orders that reflect Occidentalism or Westernization. It is hardly a coincidence, therefore, that the United States of America is today's leading agent of globalization. They're experiencing, of course, challenge from China. I am not talking a great deal about China here. But then, of course, you're aware of that competition between the two. So, like I said, it is hardly a coincidence that, therefore, that the United States of America is today's leading agent of globalization, and even global powers such as the United States, or rather United Kingdoms and France, though not settlement colonies, had built powerful economic systems thanks to huge colonial empires, which allowed them total control of the natural resources of colonized nations until the mid-20th century. Colonization and empire resulted in the encounter of peoples, languages, cultures, as well as the movement of capital and labor, often in a context of inequality whereby the imperial language and culture are clearly dominant. The spatial distribution of major languages and cultures in today's globalized world can be traced to the pattern of colonization. If you look at how English and other top languages are spread today, it is, in most cases, really traced through the pattern of colonization. This evolving linguiscape, as I call it, evolving linguiscape, due to migration or relocation of peoples, often reflects the tension between the dominant colonial language and the marginalized indigenous languages. Slavery, a corollary of colonization, saw the widespread relocation and forced migration of people around the globe. The exploitation of labor for economic gains, inasmuch as the same way as in current globalization, where underprivileged people toil for mere pittance, usually in sweatshops, and ultimately for the commercial and material benefit of the developed world, and some parts of the underdeveloped world as well. It can therefore be assumed that Western colonization, whether trade, settlement, or exploitation colonization, and empire, had set the stage for the kind of power asymmetry evident in current globalization practices, whether economic, cultural, linguistic. This power imbalance explains somewhat the tendency to resort to translation as a strategy for understanding or grasping the other, as practiced by anthropologists, administrators, and missionaries in colonial times, translation was mainly unidirectional into the colonial language, as indigenous oral traditions and texts were the main focus. There was a thirst for the exotic, understanding or grasping the mind of the native and their worldview, to ensure total control, or better yet, to hold them up as a mirror or contrast to Western modernity. Even here, as is often the case in contemporary globalization, there was a paternalistic need to raise or bring the native into the fold of Western enlightenment and modernity. The desire to shape the native into one's own likeness recalls the homogenizing trend characteristic of globalization, a trend that has been referred to as the McDonaldization or Americanization of the world. When translation was carried out in the dominated indigenous languages, it was often to ultimately achieve similar goals, as was the case of translations carried out by missionaries for the sole purpose of religious conversion and evangelization, or translation done by linguists to alphabetize or given written form to a mainly oral tradition or literature. Like today's globalization, colonization fed into the myth of the language of empire, all-powerful and far-reaching, which has forever established the inequality or asymmetry of power at the basis of translation and intercultural communication between the global north and the global south. It can be argued, therefore, that the demise of colonization did very little to stump or slow down the rapid trajectory towards globalization. The creation of post-colonial independent states was often based on political systems that were essentially clones or adaptations of the governing systems of the colonial metropole. Also, the partition of Africa among European colonialists eventually led to the creation of nation-states without regard for historically well-defined boundaries of ethnicities, languages, and cultures. These conditions were, from the very inception of the nation-states in Africa, for instance, extremely favorable to outside encroachment and the continued reliance on former colonies, or former colonizers, if you want. The post-colonial condition, therefore, is highly conducive and permeable to the kind of globalization driven by the West. The post-colonial has become a metaphor for engaging the unequal power relations between the global South and the global North. As an ideological construct, it seeks to represent a view or the perspective of the dominated or oppressed or marginalized. Its relation with globalization has to do with the strategic creation of post-colonial nations, ensuring political and economic dependency on colonial metropole, and subsequently constituting a marketplace for all manners of Western commodification. Language is arguably the most important or the most impactful legacy of colonization. The imposition and subsequent adoption of colonial language ensured the continued domination of post-colonial societies by Western powers and laid the groundwork for the kind of dependency that has in turn facilitated the spread of globalization. Just as colonialism placed the colonies squarely within the sphere of influence of the colonial power, so did post-colonial arrangements ensure the continued influence of such powers. A main characteristic of the relationship between post-colonialism and globalization is the attainment of global status by the major colonial languages. If English is today considered to be a global language, it is because the language had been imposed on vast territories under British colonial rule. Even in nations that were never within the British Empire, either as exploitation or settlement colonies, the English language thrived initially as the language of trade. It is not surprising therefore, that post-colonial theory, which seeks to represent the voice of the subaltern or the other, had made language one of its most important arenas for redressing the power imbalance or inequalities between the global south and the global north. While some post-colonial writers have lamented the use of colonial languages for the expression of local art and literature, such as Ngugi wa Thiong'o that you know, who stopped writing creatively in English and reverted back to his native Gikuyu, and then translated his native Gikuyu into English, others have claimed the colonial language and viewed the colonial language as part and parcel of their national heritage. For the Nigerian novelist Chinua Achebe, English is today seen as an African language insofar as the language has taken on an African inflection in line with African idioms and expressions. In order to redress the inequality implied in the global status of English vis-à-vis local African languages, the writer must subvert English, transforming it into a local idiom in a process at times referred to as glocalization, the localization of global languages, that often involves translation, marked by a power differential between cultures of orality and writing. In the context of globalization, therefore, post-colonial theory encourages an alignment against linguistic neo-imperialism, and the writing practice recalls translation as a strategy to resist imperial domination and to redress power imbalance. In its various manifestations worldwide, English becomes a lingua franca for its various speakers, intent on preserving their national linguistic resources, as well as their identity in direct contrast to the globalist neo-colonial or neoliberal discourse of monolingualism and uniformity. This indeed invokes the concept of panlingual globalization, which aims to offset the drift towards monolingualism through English by the practice of panlingual translation. The latter ensures the representation of minor languages and cultures in translation between unequal entities. Panlingual translation asserts the power of vernacularity in situations of linguistic globalization. The revival of world literature has a lot to do with panlingual globalization. Globalization is therefore non-linear and thrives on the tension between sameness and difference, the hallmark of post-coloniality, which is mobilized to assert subaltern identity with the globalized cultural linguistic landscape. The intersection of post-colonial and globalization can therefore be understood in terms of the interaction of sameness and difference, which generates hybridity, multiplicity. This interaction is simultaneously globalized and localized, hence the characteristic of nonlinear globalization or glocalization mentioned earlier. Glocalization makes possible the practice of panlingual or pan translation, which in effect accounts for minority representations in our increasingly global world. The link between neocolonialism and globalization is pretty obvious. I always see them together. And while post-colonialism was there to allow the colonial masters to continue to control things, neocolonialism seems to be a lot more about the economic aspect of the arrangement. And the fact that the colonies had created this, the colonizers have created colonies, you have a feeling that they have some kind of a chasse gardée, places that are their places that they own and can be sure to have trade without any problems. Since I'm running out of time, I will state this. My interest is in what Achille Mbembe calls dysfunctional post-colonies, which he locates within sub-Saharan Africa. These dysfunctional colonies are known for their corruption, for their lack of responsibility, which Mbembe therefore says people survive through a kind of convivial relationship, and says people have a sort of impassivity towards things because they want to save their lives, what he calls a sense of zombification. To give you an example of all this, I would go to the examples so that we don't lose time. I would go to the examples that I have here just to tell you how post-colonial literature deals with these situations that are very hard for them to deal with in terms of what they understand neocolonialism to be. Take this first passage. Most people who know Nigerian literature would know this. When I passed the elementary 6 exam, I wanted to go to secondary school, but my mama told me that she cannot pay the fees. The thing paid me bad because I wanted to be a big man, like lawyer or doctor, riding car and talking big English. In fact, I used to know English in the school, and every time I would try to read any book that I see. Now you see the child soldier, this is a book about child soldier, uneducated, being very regretful of the fact that he is not educated and thinking about the possibility of being able to educate themselves. The means are not there compared to the elite. Okay. And so, the point I'm making here is that he would like to talk like big English, talk like big men, the big people, but he cannot do so because he is illiterate, semi-literate, child soldier, and doesn't have the means or the potential to get that far. And if you notice, the language that this literature uses is a language that reflects the language of the people itself. It's English, but used in a very specific way. And that is what is quite important. Specific way to stump or resist what you would call the globalizing effect of English. A way of asserting Englishness within the world literary marketplace. And I find that to be particularly interesting. The next one, so that I stay on time. So from that time, wherever I go, people are calling me Sosa Boy. Sosa Boy. Even I am very famous in Dukana Sef. When they call me Sosa Boy, I will answer well. Even I begin to tell people that my name is Sosa Boy. If I go to any person's house and I knock and that person asks me, or asks who is it, or who is that, I will answer Sosa Boy. I like the name well. He's taking pride in being a soldier. It's a teen soldier. This is a, what they call child soldier. Because he is emulating the authority of the country, which is a military regime. He has no other way to be able to feel elated, good in his society. And he takes pride in his nickname, Sosa Boy, in a way to show how the difference between the masses and the elite is quite significant. So that he takes pride in calling himself Sosa Boy, which is nothing. It's just a foot soldier. But for him, it is something big. He sees himself as part of the elite, or the people with power, with a uniform on. One. Then the last one, please. Who is the chief of this village? Now yourself, sir. What? Well, sir. Look, do you understand English at all? Chief Barabe began to shake his head. Then they called me with hand to come, beckon on me. So when I came near him, he began to speak Kana to me. This time no fear for him voice. Look then, this thing surprised me, Helele, meaning a lot. This is Chief Barabe who is fearing for the soldier, but giving me order in big strong voice. What does that mean? Now, you have here the very, very graphic conflict between modernity and tradition. The chief represents tradition, the young soldier, or the officer represents modernity, the government. Now the chief ceds his power, in a way, to the soldier, to the officer, because he's got power, he's got authority. Modernity crushes tradition. And the young protagonist, Sosa Boy, is impressed. Can't believe this. How is it possible that my chief, that I love and worship so much, can be so subdued vis-a-vis a soldier who is nobody, just because he wears a uniform and represents the state? So then, as a conclusion, I would say that post-colonial theory, therefore, articulates non-Western perspectives and identities and with other political practice that reverse customary power relations in the name of women and working class, or even the earth itself, meaning the environment, including sexual orientation and indigenous rights. There's a lot to say about the effect on Anthropocene, especially with the exploitation of timber, the exploitation of minerals, and how that affects the society. And this is all a matter of class between the mass and the elite, and the outside influence, the elite being almost agents, puppets, we call them puppeteers, puppets of the former colonizers or the Western powers. Post-colonial translation studies have been front and center in the quest for an ethical dimension to translation theory and practice in postmodern era. So I will call your attention, if you do want to explore the notion of pan-translation. Pan-translation, which is coined after Pan-Africanism, if you want, somehow, thinking about W.E. Du Bois's major conference of African peoples in Rome in the 1920s. Pan-translation means simply dealing with translation such that we think, always at the back of our mind, of having some fair playground, some level playground in translation. Do not always walk over the other. Do not always dominate the other. Do not always seek to, as I said earlier, make clones of the other of yourselves. Think about them as having strong cultures, even though dominated, even though colonized. In this day and age, we should be very interested in democratizing our profession and making sure that as we go on, we should never leave behind those other cultures that have very old, strong cultures that we somehow ignore because of our mainly Western orientation to translation studies. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Paul. We don't have a lot of time, but I do think you're willing to take one or two questions, because I can imagine that...
Already? Okay, that's fine.
Well, yeah.
You told me I didn't need questions, but I would like...
Well, let's do that. I can imagine that there are people who would like to ask you something. We still have 3 minutes.
Okay.
Any questions? You have convinced them all, I think.
It's a very touchy one.
Okay.
Yeah.
If not, I have a lot of... There is a question.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Do we have a mic? No. Well, just speak up.
To think about how to practice pan translation in the world of today, with the marketing of literature.
It's a very good question. Actually, pan translation was thought about mainly in regard to marketing literature. The whole thing about representing minority literatures and cultures within the global literary space. You know, about book competitions like the Booker Prize, all that. So the whole concept was about presenting this thing with the idea of retaining the cultures of these people, making sure that the cultures are there, but not doing so as if you are watering down this culture to suit a marketing strategy. In other words, make sure that this culture survives in the global marketplace, albeit in an English language. So the concept of pan translation is for the producer as well as the marketeers to understand that the translation is what it is. It's in English, but belongs to a particular culture, belongs to particular people, and to a particular context. It is not a good idea, like Venuto points out about American literature, to always endeavor, to always make this effort to somehow water down or somehow serve those cultures on a silver plate, to the dominating cultures, to the dominant society. So pan-translation can go a long way to bring about a level playing ground, and it's also already happening because there's a lot of winning of literature, Booker Prize, Man Booker Prize, by literature written in these forms, where you make sure you actually assert your identity within a literature that is global, you see. That's what I would think. Okay?
Well, actually, it's exactly 10 to 10, which is the official end.
Okay.
So don't run away, because I understood that Marius has a couple of organizational questions. Questions and messages, I suppose. And this is the perfect moment for giving you this.
Okay,
Thank you very much, Paul Bandia.
Thank you.